This is Mr. Shea, American Pageant, Chapter 10, AP United States History at Notre Dame High School. Can we begin with the growing country? Even after the first census in 1790, it's clear that the United States population has continued to grow, much like it did in its early colonial period, recording 4 million citizens living in the United States at the time. What was clearly obvious is still the continued growth of cities, especially the ones listed here in New York, Boston, Charleston, Baltimore. Yet its population was still primarily rural, 90%, and only 5% had actually moved west of the Appalachian Mountains. So people, although remember, as a result of the Proclamation of 1763 and pre-revolutionary era, were extremely frustrated over their inability due to that treaty signed with Great Britain and Pontiac, that they wanted to move west of the Appalachians. Most did not. It was still a very rugged country, very difficult country. Those who did move there, were very independent minded, were so removed from civilization that they really could be considered not less than American, actually very American, just very disconnected where they were. They also had to deal with the Spanish who controlled the Mississippi River and the British who supplied Native Americans with weapons and faced constant raids and dangers as a result. The first presidential election in 1789 saw George Washington win the only unanimous electoral college election in our nation's history. Very similar theme to him as a general. His strength of character was his biggest strength, not so much his political know-how or experience. Plus his fame gained, obviously, from the Revolutionary War. Washington would have his inauguration in New York City on Wall Street. He'd have to establish as president several precedents, and that's precedents with a C. And precedents are just establishing a way of doing things, whatever those are. In the simplest terms, in your classroom, a teacher establishes a precedent by how he or she is going to discipline talking in the class or late assignments, things like that. Washington established several precedents. Well, one of those precedents was establishing a cabinet. And it's mentioned loosely that the president could establish individuals to give written opinions, but he takes it a step further and establishes a cabinet, setting up departments and his new leadership council. At first, there's three cabinet positions: Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State's in charge of foreign affairs. He's the foreign chief diplomat. The Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and Secretary of War Henry Knox. Currently, we don't have a Secretary of War. We call it the Secretary of Defense. The Bill of Rights was something argued for during the ratification process between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. It was promised to the Anti-Federalists while ratification was debated in Massachusetts and New York, but it actually had to be put into law once the Constitution was ratified. James Madison headed this task. In order for future amendments to pass, according to the Constitution, uh, they needed 2/3 of the states or a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. So James Madison, although this is necessary, is really the author of these rights, and they safeguard those individual liberties we know today. We talked a little bit in class: speech, press, assembly, religion, the right to bear arms, the Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination. It protects against cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, and beyond that, if we look at the Ninth and Tenth Amendments on the next slide, we get a really good idea of how James Madison smartly included so much more, because the Ninth Amendment mentions, and to sum it up, basically says that, look, even though it may not be mentioned specifically, people clearly have other rights outside of the ones listed here um, under the Constitution. So the 10th Amendment is the reserved clause in the Constitution, and it basically states that anything that is not or anything that comes along that is not specifically governed, or there's not a specific federal law, the power to legislate over that particular issue falls to the states automatically. So the states will have the first crack at legislating for certain things, and that's reserved powers. You know, you can think of countless examples, but you know that there's no federal law regarding smoking in indoor establishments. So when smoking in indoor establishments became an issue and people realized the health risks, it was a state by state decision. That power to legislate that fell to the states, not the federal government. Now, of course, the federal government could pass an amendment making it a federal law, but ultimately the first crack at legislating uh, different issues that pop up falls to the states. The Judiciary Act of 1799 actually establishes what the court system is going to look like. It's grown since then to 9 Supreme Court justices, but federal courts and circuit courts. And John Jay becomes the country's first Chief Justice. And really, in 1789, no one is exactly sure how the Supreme Court is going to function, what its role is going to be. It's not until 1803 in Marbury v. Madison where the power of the Supreme Court, or the usual power exercised by the Supreme Court of judging whether laws are constitutional or unconstitutional, is first established. This gives you an idea of the evolution of the cabinet. Starting in 1789, the first three, and then the Attorney General is added later in the same year, and then Secretary of Navy, and it goes down all the way until 2002, Secretary of Homeland Security, which was added right after 9/11, 2001. So Alexander Hamilton plays an enormous role in this new government as Secretary of the Treasury. He has a very clear and concise idea of how to establish the country in the international community and to strengthen it financially. And one of the first ideas he has is he wants to establish and strengthen the country's credit. Remember that as a result of the Articles of Confederation and the Revolutionary War, the national debt was very large and growing. State debts from the war were large and growing, and it was impossible to fund. And interest was going higher and higher because really the credit worthiness of the United States was not that good. So Hamilton had some choices, when he took over this post, and he decided they were going to fund at par, which basically meant the Congress was going to pay off the entire debt. So it could have worked out arrangements and figured ways out to have some debt forgiven, most likely, but he doesn't want to do that. He wants to take it on and pay it all off to establish the country's credit. He also wants to take on the state debts. You say, well, why would he want to take on the state debts? He believed that if Congress were to take on the state debts, then it would tie all the states more to that national chariot. That the national government, the federal government, would become stronger and more important in the eyes of all the states and the international community. Now, what's the law that allows him to do this? Because it seems like it's a stretch, not really in the Constitution. But he uses the theory of assumption. And assumption really is all about the assumption that the state debts that have been incurred were a direct result of the Revolutionary War. Therefore, the federal government can acquire those state debts and take it off or take the burden away from the states and put it on the federal government. So who's opposed to this and who's in favor? Well, those heavy debtor states like Massachusetts, like New York during the time, were very much in favor of this because their state debts were lifted. But those states that did not have a great deal of debt, like Virginia, were not as encouraged. I mean, why would they want to take on the responsibility? Because ultimately, who's going to pay these debts? It's going to be taxpayers. And so why would they want to take on these state debt burdens and have those attached to the federal government, which then would be paid for through taxes from all the different states? So they weren't exactly crazy about it, but they were interested in Alexander Hamilton's proposal to make a deal with them. They wanted the prestige of having the federal capital, the new District of Columbia, established just off the Potomac River, and therefore Virginia, along with Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton was able to convince Thomas Jefferson to support this idea in return for establishing the national capital in the South. So the national debt is over 75 million. I mean, today, $75 million is accrued in interest in probably about a week or two. Uh, Hamilton is given the title of Father of the National Debt, but he believed it was a national blessing. The reason he believed that is because with a national debt, all those who the government owes money to have a vested interest in the success of the new nation. Ultimately, they want to see the nation succeed so that they'll have the opportunity to have their debts repaid or the interest paid over a period of time. Hamilton didn't want to pay off the debt right away. He wanted to pay it off over a period of time so that he kept that vested interest alive as the country grew. So, how to pay off this debt, or at least continue to make interest payments? The only way to do that for a government are taxes. The first tax is a tariff law, and it's on imports. 8%. It's not overly ambitious of a tariff. It's a small tariff, clearly to raise revenue. That's its primary goal, but also to protect young American manufacturing that was just establishing. Imposing a tax on imports makes those manufactured goods that are coming into a country slightly more expensive, so that those goods made in the country by American manufacturers become a little bit more affordable and give the American manufacturers a slight advantage because their goods can sell at a more affordable rate. One of his mainstays of his program was to favor the manufacturing class, the wealthy class, so that they would make more money, and in turn that would trickle down to the ordinary citizens. The second tax, much less popular, was the excise tax. And the excise tax put a direct tax on a few goods, but the primary one was whiskey. And the problem with this tax is it primarily affects a very small group of individuals, distillers, who are producing this whiskey, and they feel exploited by this tax. And Jefferson believed that this was an unfair tax on farmers. This gives you an idea of the total debt owed, where it all came from. And you see the federal domestic debt would be American investors. Okay, so what is the financial structure or the financial linchpin to all these plans? And for Hamilton, it was the Bank of the United States. He believed that the United States can be a fractional stockholder, that means a part owner in this bank. He believes that the federal government will be able to take surpluses, that's money above and beyond what they're spending, raised from tax revenue, and deposit it into this bank, which would benefit the economy because it would keep the economy with more money and currency in circulation. It can regulate money supply, print money if needed, creating again a stable national currency, but also the opportunity for growth. If it can print money, it can promote growth. You need more money in order to grow. And he believed that the national government needed to create and charter this bank. But others believed that the central government should not establish a bank in the United States. People like Jefferson believed that the Constitution did not say that the government had this power. Therefore, the states had the power, and they were the ones who should charter these banks. Hamilton invoked the clause of the Constitution that stipulates that Congress may pass any laws which is the necessary and proper to carry out the powers. Remember, the Constitution is written very loosely. It's a loose framework. It's a loose skeleton document that does allow for a lot of interpretation. So Hamilton believed that this clause, because it was clearly for the good of the country, can be invoked in establishing the Bank of the United States. And this really goes to the way Hamilton and Jefferson viewed the Constitution individually. Hamilton was a very loose constructionist. That meant he looked at the Constitution as being constructed in a very loose way to be interpreted so that the necessary actions could be taken or employed by Congress for the betterment of the country, whereas Jefferson was a strict constructionist, and he believed that if it wasn't written explicitly in the Constitution, then that power did not exist for the federal government. It would pass to the states. And if the federal government wanted that power, it must pass an constitutional amendment in order to gain that power. Okay. Okay, so ultimately, Hamilton's views prevail. Washington signed the bank measure into law, and the Bank of the United States is chartered for 20 years. It started out with $10 million in capital, one-fifth of which was owned by the federal government, and the remaining four-fifths was sold at public sale through stock offerings. It was a very popular purchase for many investors. The excise tax comes back to sort of haunt Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion, where several distillers rise up, very revolutionary type manner, and begin to tar and feather tax collectors, and to the point where tax collectors just ultimately can't do their jobs. Washington and Hamilton believe that this is a very dangerous time because they cannot have a country that feels that every time this government, which ultimately does allow for representation. That's a big difference between pre-revolutionary and this new government. Individuals have representation and a voice in Congress, and ability to get their voices across if they don't like the laws, and for those individuals, congressmen, to argue for those changes. So it cannot be established that these types of uprisings and revolts are allowed. So he gathers a very strong force of 13,000 to march to southwestern Pennsylvania and shut this rebellion down. By the time they get there, really the mob has dispersed and it's ended. It's not overly important as far as casualties go, but it was very important as far as it goes to establishing the new government, and that taxes were going to have to be paid, and the way to argue these taxes was not going to be an open rebellion. Hamilton's plan, the Bank of the United States, the new debt consolidation, the handling of the Whiskey Rebellion that him and Washington went through, began to really create a separation between his ideals of a very strong federal government, loose constructionist, the way of viewing the Constitution, and Thomas Jefferson, who was a very strict constructionist and a very strong supporter of state rights. The two began to battle bitterly in the cabinet, oftentimes arguing loudly, and Washington having to separate them. Washington almost entirely always favors Hamilton's viewpoints, and so unbeknownst to Washington at the time, the seed was planted for future political parties, something that the founders of the Constitution did not take into consideration. Once the two-party system is established, as they call Jeffersonian Republicans, and as it begins to grow in popularity, we know that the United States will have a two-party system, primarily a two-party system. They'll have be more than two at times, and certainly more than two over the country's history. But the two-party system ends up being a very good system for the United States over its history, because the party out of power balances out and gives people equal voice, and really has been really strengthened our democracy. This shows you the history of the political parties. The Federalists really die out after the War of 1812. The Democratic Republicans established by Jefferson are the early. This is the party connected to today's modern Democratic Party. The Federalists. And by the way, the Democratic Republicans become the Republicans only during the era of good feelings. Then the National Republicans spring up. They don't last too long. The Whigs, we remember them from before. It's a different political party, but the idea of them. And then the Republicans, established in 1854, actually as an anti-slavery party during the pre-Civil War era. And it's at that point, sorry guys, that the Republicans are established. So, okay. So the guillotine picture here, clearly we're going to move into the French Revolution. This is where really the two parties separate completely. as a result of the French Revolution. Even though the French Revolution obviously is not here in the United States, politically it has huge impacts and creates enormous divides here in America. When the French Revolution first starts, most Americans cheer it. They're excited about the idea of this French Revolution built on the American principles of liberty. It's something that appeals to many Americans. There's only some very conservative Federalists who are opposed to any possibility of change that might disrupt what the early American Republic is trying to accomplish. But once the guillotine is set up and the king is beheaded in 1793, the church is attacked, and the reign of terror begins. At this point, the divide in America amongst political parties becomes very obvious, whereas the Federalists look at this as a mobocracy, very dangerous form of rebellion, not modeled on the American Revolution at all. But the Jeffersonian Democrats see it still as a necessary evil to accomplish the goals of liberty. So now there's a very strong divide. And what is Washington going to do? As especially once Great Britain enters the war with France, declares war on France. What is Washington going to do? Is he going to honor the treaty with France established during the Revolutionary War, or and put the country, a young country, in danger and expose the young nation, or is he going to do something else and really go against the popular opinion? So the Jeffersonian Democrats favor honoring the alliance, the 1778 alliance with France. But Washington understood that even though the French had saved America in the Revolutionary War, it was not the right time. I mean, America did not have a strong navy, barely a navy at all, did not have a standing army, did not have the funds necessary. Hamilton's debt plan was just beginning to get off the ground, and the country was just beginning to be able to fund or borrow money again, thanks to Hamilton's debt plan and the buildup of credit. So the United States was not in a position to fight a war. Washington instead decides, and Jefferson will agree to this at first, but it's going to change. The Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 was favored by Jefferson at the time because he understood that the country was not ready for war and wanted to avoid war at all costs. And Washington really goes against the crowd here, which is admirable, and that's, again, his strength of character. And it would work out for a while, except that Great Britain, after the Neutrality Proclamation, Great Britain would really begin to challenge the ability of the United States to remain neutral when it began to raid uncontrollably American merchant ships. It began to it began to impress American sailors, which means forcing them, taking their ships and then forcing them into military service. These types of actions were provoking American neutrality. We'll get to that in another slide here. Also, Citizen Edmund Genet is a very interesting character because he's a young 30-year-old representative of the French Republic, and even though the Americans had declared neutrality, he shows up in South Carolina, begins to recruit volunteers to serve, begins to encourage individuals to even attack Spanish Florida, and he really is so pompous and arrogant in his belief. And he's summoned to Washington, D.C. In Washington, he speaks down to George Washington as the President of the United States. Washington has him removed from the country, and a new representative replaces him. Okay, so the Neutrality Proclamation, although it seemed like a slap in the face to the French, they really didn't mind it because keeping the Americans away as far as being allies kept trade alive with the Americans. If they'd not done that, British blockades would have occurred. It would have cut off trade from America to France. So really, America being neutral was more useful to France. It didn't affect the relationship at all. This map shows some of the battles that took place with Native Americans. Probably the most significant being 1794, Wayne's victory at Fallen Timbers. which we'll get to in a second. But essentially, you see the area we're still the United States is still fighting over uh, the Ohio River Valley, and the Native Americans who are fighting Wayne and terrorizing Americans are supplied primarily by the British. Okay. All right. So again, here I just kind of repeated myself, but the British openly selling firearms to the Miami Confederacy, which again caused several issues, and the British really had never left after the Revolutionary War and will not leave until after the War of 1812. So it's always a difficult situation for Washington to deal with, and later John Adams. But once Matt Anthony Wayne defeats the Miamis at the Battle of Fallen Timber, the British would not support them, would not back them up, would not negotiate peace with the Americans. They've just basically abandoned the Native Americans. And so the Treaty of Greenville, the Native Americans realizing, well, we don't have any support, we now have to make peace, signed the Treaty of Greenville, and it gave the United States, a larger area, which the Native Americans promised not to bother or raid, and in return, Native Americans, you can see what they received, $20,000. What a great deal, huh? And an annual price of $9,000 every year. And in return, they were still able to hunt on the land, still to travel on the land. So, and the Native Americans believed that at least they had established their sovereignty. Clearly, that's going to change as time moved on. Okay, here are the slides that we deal with impressment by the British, attacking of American merchant ships. And remember, during all these things, news keeps spreading of all these attacks, and Washington is badgered with pressure to declare war on Great Britain, ally itself with the French. This is disrespectful to the United States. But Washington understands there is no way the United States is ready to fight a war with Great Britain. It would destroy Hamilton's plan, economic plan, and the United States was too fragile and too young to take that chance. So he goes the other way, and this really outrages Jeffersonian Republicans. He decides to send an envoy to Great Britain, led by Chief Justice John Jay. And remember, they don't. The Chief Justice, the Supreme Court, nobody's really sure just what they're going to do yet, how they're going to exercise their powers. So Washington uses John Jay as a chief diplomat in 1794. He is treated harshly. He is criticized heavily by his wanting of continuing British traditions, such as kissing the Queen's hand. And the British take advantage of him, knowing that he's not in a position of strength to negotiate. So he doesn't win too many concessions. The British promise to compensate for the damages they've caused American merchants, but make no promise of not attacking future American ships, or about supplying Native Americans, or about abandoning their posts in and around the United States in the North. So very little is done, but Jay's treaty is significant. Again, now the Democratic Republican Party, led by the Jefferson, felt that this was a very inadequate treaty. They felt betrayed by John Jay. They felt they betrayed the French. The French are extremely upset with this treaty. They feel betrayed. We'll get to that in a second. The Spanish, fearing an alliance with Great Britain and the United States, though, does move quickly to sign Pinckney's Treaty of 1795. And Pinckney's Treaty of 1795 gave America everything it wanted: the ability to trade out of the Mississippi River, western Florida. Right, this treaty is very advantageous to the United States. So although Jay's treaty was very unsuccessful with Great Britain, it did provide for Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. And Pinckney's Treaty in 1795, which you don't need to know now, but that's going to lead to the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1813. All right, and that's where the United States might be 1817. I think I might have messed that up. I'll have to double check on that. Where the United States actually gains control of Florida. Following Pinckney's Treaty, Washington is going to retire. He's not going to run for a third term, establishing a new precedent of presidents only running for 2 terms and not running for a third term if they win the first 2, so that presidents would not be viewed as more than just that, or no creation of a monarchy. The first president to break this tradition of running for a third consecutive term will be FDR, and he will win. In fact, he'll win 4 terms in office. Some people think it's Teddy Roosevelt, but remember, Teddy Roosevelt took over for the assassinated McKinley, served 2 terms, did not run for a third term, but then ran for a third term after sitting out 4 years against Taft and Woodrow Wilson in 1912. In his farewell address, he warns against permanent alliances. He does not mean that Washington's against permanent alliances. He's in favor of temporary alliances for measures that were immediate concerns. He advocates against political parties, although he knows it's too late for that. So, what did Washington accomplish? Expanding west. The federal government, Hamilton's debt plan, as much as it was criticized, was successful, and the new country was taken from very unsound footing under the Articles of Confederation to extremely sound footing and a strong base following Washington's first 8 years. He also has successfully kept, although very difficult to do so, the young country out of war with France or Great Britain. John Adams, really the leading voice behind the Revolutionary War, wins a slim victory over Thomas Jefferson in 1796. He will take over the presidency really at a time where the country is on a precarious, really in a precarious situation because the French were so upset with Jay's treaty that now the French turn as an enemy to the United States. Meanwhile, the British still aren't laying off attacking British merchant ships. So Adams takes over at a very difficult time, really in the country's history. Remember that when the country was established, whoever finished second was actually the vice president, which today is, this changes in the 12th Amendment. I mean, you can just try to imagine some of the most recent presidential elections and imagine a President Obama, Mitt Romney vice president situation, and it was that was the way it was done. Adams, we know, we watched the film, very intelligent, very passionate, believed in a strong central government, not the most tactful, not the most well liked, had really made more enemies as vice president because he so resented the idea of what the vice president was and how much lack of power he had as vice president. But he also had the disadvantage of following the great George Washington. Even though Washington left semi-unpopular and president as a result of Jay's treaty, he's still following in the footsteps of Washington, which is a difficult shoes to fill. Him and Hamilton could not stand each other in many ways. Hamilton didn't trust him. Hamilton was also jealous that he was not the president, but Hamilton had made too many enemies to win the presidency, so he understood that he was not the logical choice. So the French, infuriated by Jay's treaty, they begin to do the same thing that the British had done. Impressment, attacking British merchant ships, just really creating turmoil in the seas and amongst American merchant ships, disrupting American trade. Adams sees this as a threat. He understands the threat, and he sends a commission led by John Marshall to meet with the French to discuss terms where they can mutually agree to be beneficial for both. But upon arriving in France, the diplomats are met by 3 agents, later referred to as X, Y, and Z, and in order, and it was typical to ask for a bribe or a loan, and they demanded a loan, but also a bribe of $250,000 just to meet with Charles Maurice, just to meet with him, without any guarantees of any kind of settlement. They took this as an insult. They left, and when they returned, the fact that they turned it down, they are considered heroes. And it's very significant because the sentiment in the French, towards the French, even among the Jeffersonian Republicans, takes a 180, a roundabout, and all of a sudden the French are hated, and the John Adams and the commission are very popular. But as a result of this, the United States enters a year and a half to 2 year period of undeclared war with France, where the Navy is built up, the Marine Corps is reestablished, an army is raised, and Adams is reluctant to do these things but feels like it's necessary, although he still at all times wants to avoid a full-out war. He is just like Washington, understanding that that is not what the young country would need. But there are several French ships that are captured or sunk, along with many American ships that face the same fate. But Adams, as a result, is becoming more and more popular during this time. It shows the idea of how fast the American ship was being built up. The French realized, as well as the Americans, that they really didn't want to fight the Americans at this point in their history. They wanted to avoid it. The French minister offers, a plea or of really an apology, and says, please send new representatives so that they could work something out. Now, Adams, although so popular, understands that peace is more advantageous to the United States than war, and he's going to send these representatives, even though if he had not sent them, the point is, if he had not sent them and gone to war with France, or continued at least the undeclared war with France through his election of 1800, he would have almost assuredly won the election of 1800 in the presidency. But instead, they reached a deal with Bonaparte, who was the young leader here of the French, and we're going to see him again, obviously, a lot. And in the Convention of 1800, the treaty that was signed in Paris ends the hostilities between the two, and also establishes a working relationship with Bonaparte, which is going to be advantageous to Jefferson in 1803, when he buys essentially a third of the United States for $15 million. Okay. So even though Jefferson, Adams was unpopular as a result of this, he deserves a lot of credit because, again, he went against the popular opinion. He sacrificed political gain for country's good, and that has to be admired. What really hurt Adams, in addition to ending the war, was really the Federalist Congress pushing through the Alien and Sedition laws. The Alien laws, which made citizenship requirements go from 5 to 14 years, as well as giving the president the ability to deport those individuals who he believed could be spies or working for other governments. And this was really against the principles of the early United States. And the worst one was a sedition law. Sedition law suppresses two key rights outlined in the Bill of Rights: freedom of speech, freedom of press. If you said something bad about the president, or bad about the Federalist Party, or the party in power, or the country itself, you can be jailed and fined. And this was carried out. And John Adams reluctantly supported these laws, and especially the sedition law, with really the ruining of him in the election of 1800, because the Jeffersonian Republicans cited the suppression of individual liberties by a strong, strangling central government, and if they were willing to take away these liberties, what else would they be willing to take away? Jefferson and Madison go further to officially protest the Alien Sedition laws with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and the idea being, under the compacts theory, that states give the right to govern, the power to govern, to the federal government. Therefore, states have the right or the power, if the federal government oversteps its boundaries or its limits, to nullify federal law in their states and not follow those laws. The Supreme Court, appointed by the judicial branch, appointed by Federalists at this point, obviously George Washington appoints the federal judges, did not support this claim. And although Jefferson and Madison had hoped to find support from other states led by Federalist leaders refused to support and even condemned the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. But it did establish another precedent, a strong fighting for state rights, which would be used, and this precedent and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions would be used two more times in the future in the nullification crisis during Andrew Jackson's presidency, and then again in secession from the Union by South Carolina and other states right at the beginning of the Civil War. That's kind of just what I said here on this slide. Apologize. So even though Jefferson and Madison had no intention of leaving the Union or breaking the Union, they were just trying to cement the case for their argument against John Adams and the Federalist Party through the writing of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Once the election of 1800 came around, the two parties were clearly divided and their ideas were clearly defined. And we talk about what's a platform of a political party. And if you think of the modern day Republican and Democratic Party, you could probably think of a few things. The more conservative being the Republicans, the idea of them lower taxes, less government involvement, less regulations. The Democrats being more government involvement, social programs, higher taxes paid by the wealthy to pay for more government promoted programs. Well, back then, you see the Federalists ruled by the best people, whereas the Democrats ruled by the informed masses. Hostile to the extension of democracy, friendliness towards extension of democracy, weak central government, power central government, loose interpretation of the Constitution. The Federalists, remember, just interpreting it for the common good, whereas the Democratic Republicans believe it had to be written in the Constitution in order for the government to act. Protective tariff, no special risk manufacturers, and it goes on and on. You guys can take a look on this in the chart in your book, but it gives a really good idea of the differences. The central bank, whereas Democratic Republicans encourage state banks, and you see the restrictions on free speech and press. That's a killer for the Federalist Party as a result of the sedition laws. That was Jefferson. Okay, we'll finish the election of 1800 in the next chapter. Good luck on the quiz.